Emergency Autoland activated. The Emergency Autoland system is controlling the aircraft and will land at the safest nearby airport. Emergency Autoland has already informed air traffic control of your situation. Your estimated time to landing is shown on the top of all three displays. Your airplane has begun maneuvering into position for the final approach to landing. The Emergency Autoland system is controlling all flight functions. Wait for aircraft and propeller to stop before exiting the aircraft.
And that's the new Garmin Autoland system talking to the passengers as it executes an automatic landing. Hello and welcome back to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe when you fly. I'm Max Truscott. After the news, for our main topic today, we'll be talking about Autoland with several people I met while I was visiting Garmin headquarters last week. And if you happen to think, Autoland, what's the big deal? Remember, this is the first system that lets a passenger safely land an aircraft. And I think it's just the starting point for what will undoubtedly be many more auto-landing type capabilities in the future. Later in the show, we'll have listener questions, including one from a private pilot who asked about fuel selection valves and why pilots don't just leave it in the both position. And I'll explain why not all aircraft have a both position on the fuel selector valve, plus much, much more. And of course, if you're thinking someday you might want to buy a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision Jet, or you'd like flight training in any one of these, well, there are a lot of things I can help you with, and I can certainly point you in other directions if I can help you. So please give me a call at 650-967-2500 for free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 126 with Rob Lober, we talked about what it takes to start a charter business. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. This week in the news, the FAA may soon allow pilots with diabetes to fly commercial jets. And there's an exciting 4-place turboprop, which is for sale. And we have a fun story about someone who proposed marriage in a very unusual way. All this and more, and the news starts now. From CNN.com, the FAA to allow pilots with diabetes to fly commercial jets. The FAA is set to allow pilots with insulin-treated diabetes to fly commercial airliners, according to a Department of Transportation official who spoke with CNN. The new protocol, which could be applied as early as next week, will allow pilots with insulin-treated diabetes to apply for a first or second-class medical, which is required to fly commercially. Since 1996, pilots with insulin-treated diabetes have been allowed to act as pilot in command of an airplane in the U.S., but only on private flights. They could not act as pilots on airliners or other commercial flights. The FAA maintained this position even as countries like the UK and Canada gradually allowed pilots with diabetes to fly commercially, provided there was a second pilot in the cockpit. AOPA, which supported the change, applauded the forthcoming decision. Quote, many private pilots who are insulin dependent have been flying safely since 1996. With medical advancements such as continuous glucose monitoring along with proper protocols, the FAA's impending proposal should help many highly qualified pilots fly commercially, said Jim Kuhn, the Senior VP of Government Affairs for AOPA. In the past, the concern was that a pilot with diabetes may suffer an episode of high or low blood sugar in flight, which could potentially lead to an emergency situation if the pilot passes out or loses control of the aircraft. Episodes of low blood sugar, known as hypoglycemia, are particularly dangerous. For that reason, the FAA deemed it too risky to allow pilots with insulin-treated diabetes to control a commercial aircraft. Quote, a hypoglycemic event, which can result in impaired cognitive function, seizures, unconsciousness, and even death, that occurs in the cockpit of a commercial flight has the potential to place the safety of hundreds of individuals in jeopardy, the FAA wrote in a court filing in early October in a lawsuit brought by a pilot looking to ease the rules on medical certification. Pilots with diabetes that does not require insulin treatment are at a substantially lower risk of severe episodes of low blood sugar. But advances in the treatment of diabetes and the management of blood sugars have mitigated that risk, the FAA stated in the court filing on October 7th. Quote, recent advances in technology and diabetes medical science have allowed the FAA to develop an evidence-based protocol that can both identify a subset of low-risk applicants whose glycemic stability is sufficiently controlled and can ensure these pilots can safely maintain diabetic control for the duration of a commercial flight, wrote the federal air surgeon Michael Berry. Continuous glucose monitors that constantly monitor blood sugar are now readily available, while improvements in insulin pumps have made the delivery of insulin easier and more reliable among other options. And the Airline Pilots Association weighed in. They said ALPA is pleased that the FAA will be implementing this long overdue policy change that will allow pilots who are insulin dependent to continue their airline careers. ALPA has been advocating for years for the FAA to join the global community in revising their career-ending position that pilots who are diagnosed with insulin-treated diabetes cannot continue to hold their first-class medical certificates. And from AOPA.org, Honeywell predicts a single pilot future. That's something we've talked a lot about on the Airplane Geeks podcast. Technology gains will allow for safe flight with one pilot, the story says. Honeywell executives believe that technology will pave the way for automation to support single-pilot commercial operations in the next 5 to 7 years. And this story came out of a forum at the NBAA convention in Las Vegas late last month. Story written by Tom Haynes says technology is supporting the emergency electrical VTOL and urban air mobility UAM segments will provide for safeguards and the confidence to allow for the elimination of the co-pilot in the next few years, especially for cargo operations, according to Bindu Shava, Director of Project Management at Honeywell Aerospace. Shava was one of 4 young Honeywell executives on a panel discussing the future of the company at NBAA. Amanda King, who oversees aircraft connectivity, said the future is about speed. UAM will speed people to their destinations. Supersonic business jets are back on the horizon, and high-speed airborne connectivity will allow not only for speed of communications among people, but also the ability to share data in real time off the aircraft, potentially eliminating the need for black boxes in the future as the aircraft transmits data to the cloud for analysis and tracking. King said Honeywell's latest connectivity system can report on the fly what is happening on the airplane and provide predictive maintenance data to ground crews while also helping flight crews pinpoint optimal flight profiles based on real-time ambient conditions and potential air traffic congestion at major hubs. From avweb.com, the FAA completes runway status lights rollout. Now, this is a new program that I wasn't familiar with. It says all 20 airports slated to receive the FAA's runway status lights program are fully operational, said the agency. The RWSL is made up of lights embedded in the tarmac across runway crossings as well as at the departure hold zone. They illuminate when it's unsafe for an aircraft to proceed. According to the FAA, at the 15 airports where it was operational in 2017, studies found that overall there was a 52% reduction in the average runway incursion rate. The system uses the airport's surface surveillance system to determine the location of aircraft and vehicles. The lights are fully automated, requiring no input from air traffic controllers, notes the FAA, but pilots and ground vehicle operators must still receive clearance from controllers for any operation on runways or taxiways. And there's a video associated with this. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but it's kind of interesting. It shows a series of red lights that would essentially alert someone who was looking to cross a runway that runway was active. There's also a series of red lights that parallel the sides of the runway in the first, 500 feet of the runway, which would essentially warn an aircraft about to take off that the runway is blocked at some point further down the runway. From flyingmag.com, turboprop aircraft design and tooling discovered in Kansas barn. And this is written by a friend of the show, Rob Mark. He says that Brian Foley and Associates recently discovered the Interceptor 400 that was being carefully stored in obscurity on a farm in Wichita, Kansas. Not only is the actual Interceptor 400 airplane for sale, but so are the airplane's FAA type certificates, drawings, jigs, and tooling. Shortly after the Interceptor 400 was certified and a few built in the 1970s, the manufacturer had some liquidity issues and ceased production. Foley said in a news release, quote, compounding this, the aircraft was ahead of its time, certified a decade before the appearance and market acceptance of single-engine turboprops. And Rob says the Interceptor 400 could fit nicely between products like an SR20 and the TBM 900 turboprop series. The aircraft seats 4 and is powered by a single Honeywell TPE 331 turboprop capable of producing 840 shaft horsepower. The Interceptor 400 cruises at 244 knots with a maximum speed of 266 knots at altitudes up to flight level 240. It has a range of 900 nautical miles. Foley thinks many aircraft manufacturers will find the design and tooling to be an interesting way to extend their current product offerings for personal travel or as a turbine trainer for companies that also produce jet aircraft, all without what he conservatively estimates to be the $100 million cost of certifying a clean sheet design. The deal also includes the shared type certificate and tooling for the Myers 200 piston-powered aircraft, of which over 100 were built, with many still flying today. Currently owned by Interceptor Aviation, the Interceptor 400 package is being marketed by AV Strategies. And wow, this looks like yet another great opportunity for someone to jump into the aircraft production market if they would like. It's really a very slick-looking airplane, vaguely resembles a Cirrus in size, but with a much longer nose because, of course, the turboprop engine is going to be longer. And it's true, there are no four-place turboprops in the market, so I think there's definitely an opportunity here. From AOPA.org, the backcountry favorite Draco is going to be flying again. Just over a month after admitting to mistakes that caused the demise of the short takeoff and landing monster known as Draco, owner Mike Patey announced plans to resurrect the backcountry beast and improve everything. He said, "We're going to make it even better than the original Draco, which captured attention inside and outside the aviation community after the Super STOL aircraft stormed onto the scene with a screaming turboprop engine and flashing LED lights during AirVenture 2018. Patey, his wife, and a close friend survived an accident in the red high-wing turboprop as they were departing Reno State Airport following the Reno National Air Races on September 16th. I should have waited, Patey told his online audience at the time. I screwed up, made some bad choices, and as a result, I risked my family and friend, and Draco's gone." And Patey has posted a new video in which he has vowed to improve everything from the wing to the power plant to the gear. He said the drawing board again begins with a PZL-104 Wilga, a Polish-made airplane designed with piston power in mind. Plans include larger wings with an additional wing spar and a lengthened cord, higher gross weight, increased range, and more fuel capacity. Beyond that, we're going to give it nearly 1,000 shaft horsepower, a 40% increase over Draco's 680 shaft horsepower Pratt & Whitney PT6A-28. Patey explained that his lofty goals for the new Draco X, or perhaps Draco 10, included helicopter-like capability combined with fixed-wing turboprop performance. He said, "I want to fly faster than a helicopter, climb to flight level 280 above most weather, fly further than a helicopter, land in a confined area of 50 feet by 100 feet, and I want to be able to do that with 4 big guys and all their gear." Online reaction to the news was swift and generally positive. Quote, "I can't believe how emotional I am about an aircraft I've never seen in person, a pilot creator I've never met. Great news," posted one supporter on his YouTube channel. "We're about to step it up to a whole new level," Patey vowed in his video. And here's a short little story about an accident I saw in multiple different sources. This one comes from the Washington Post. It says federal investigators say a Wisconsin pilot was worried about the wet turf runway when he crashed a small plane into a pickup, killing himself and the truck driver. And just to explain, there's a highway which runs right in front of the runway that he was trying to land on. According to a preliminary report from the NTSB, the pilot told a mechanic at another airport he was concerned about a wet runway in Ledgeview and preferred to land near the end of the runway. When he returned October 17th, the pilot struck the pickup on an adjacent highway as he came for a landing. The plane was about 5 feet over the highway. The pilot was killed and the pickup driver later died. KLUK-TV reports an on-site inspection did not find anything wrong with the airframe or the engine. And this just highlights another potential gotcha because there are lots of airports that have highways that run immediately adjacent to the numbers of the runway. One, for example, that I recently landed at, it was Blue Canyon, and Interstate 80 is right next to that runway. And certainly as we were landing there, I made sure that we stayed just high enough above the runway so that we wouldn't catch any passing tractor trailers, which would have been disastrous. In international news, British Airways to fund flying lessons in 2020. British Airways is to fund flying lessons for 200 students across the UK during 2020 to inspire them to become pilots. Follows a trial program this year in partnership with the Air League Trust, when the airline funded lessons for students who would not normally be able to enjoy this experience at the Booker Aviation Flying School in High Wycombe. For 2020, the airline will expand the opportunity across numerous flying schools throughout the UK to reach a broader range of young people. Thousands of students applied via British Airways' career website for places on this year's program. Angela Williams, BA's Director of People, said, quote, "We know the importance of introducing young people, especially young women, to aviation at an early age in order to inspire them to pursue a career in the cockpit. We're passionate about improving diversity across all areas of our airline, and we're committed to investing in the next generation who will join us in connecting Britain with the world and the world with Britain." And in addition to that, British Airways has a work experience program. This year they hosted more young people on work experience than ever before, with 600 students completing a week-long placement at BA at 25 different departments in the company. Work experience is just one of many routes into the airline for young people who are ready to start their career in aviation. There's also an apprenticeship program, graduate scheme, and business placements. In 2020, BA will operate a paid summer internship, giving current university students a unique insight into the complex world of aviation as interns within its global operation. And also from the UK, this comes from the manchestereveningnews.co.uk, pilot forced to abort landing after fireworks explodes next to the airplane. Airport bosses have spoken up after a fireworks exploded next to a light airplane as it came in to land. The pilot was forced to abort the landing, but thankfully the plane touched down safely later. There were no reports of any injuries. The incident came as fireworks went on open sale. Fireworks can only be bought in the UK between October 15th and November 10th around bonfire night. City Airport in Salford, also known as the Barton Aerodrome, said at least 2 fireworks were set off underneath the main runway approach. The busy airfield is next to the M60 motorway. One of the fireworks exploded directly next to the landing plane, which then aborted its landing. In a strongly worded statement on Facebook, the airport hit out at how dangerous, stupid, and irresponsible it is to let off fireworks near an active airport. The airport is also home to the Northwest Air Ambulance and a number of flying schools. The Facebook post also said, important notice, please can we stress how dangerous, stupid, and irresponsible it is to let fireworks off in the close vicinity of an active airport. We've just had at least 2 fireworks set off on underneath our main runway approach, one of which exploded directly next to a landing aircraft, which then aborted its landing. There were calls on Facebook for police to be involved, though it's not known whether the incident was officially reported to GMP. There is a criminal charge of endangering the safety of an aircraft. And here's something rather surprising. Figures revealed by the CAA in 2015 revealed almost 80 aircraft reported safety alerts involving fireworks in the skies, with 8 aircraft actually hit, though there was no damage or injury. Manchester Airport, meanwhile, publicizes strict guidelines on the use of fireworks within certain proximities to the airport. It's also against the law for anyone to set off fireworks between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., except on certain occasions, such as bonfire night when the cutoff is at midnight, and on New Year's when the cutoff is 1 a.m. Using or selling fireworks illegally can result in a fine of up to £5,000 or 6-month imprisonment. And from generalaviationnews.com, here's a rather interesting accident report. This is from an accident that actually occurred in 2017, but the report just came out, and I thought you'd find this rather interesting. Passenger's hat flies out of plane, hits propeller. The pilot and passenger planned on a short flight around the traffic pattern in an open cockpit light sport airplane. Shortly after takeoff, as the pilot turned downwind, he heard a crack and the engine started to vibrate and lose power. He applied power, but the engine did not respond. He turned sharply left and then tried to stop the turn and descend, but the airplane continued to turn and descend until it hit a ravine near St. Mary's, Kansas. Both the pilot and passengers were seriously injured in the crash. A witness saw 2 objects fall from the airplane shortly after the engine sound stopped. Both objects were retrieved. The first was the passenger's knitted hat, the top of which was chewed up and had a line burnt melted into it. The other object was one of the propeller blades. The accident is consistent with the passenger's hat exiting the cockpit and impacting the 3-bladed pusher propeller, which led to the separation of one of the propeller blades and the subsequent loss of engine power. Probable cause? The loss of engine power due to a propeller's failure when the passenger's hat exited the cockpit and impacted the 3-blade pusher propeller, separating one of the propeller blades. And here's breaking news I read late on Wednesday night. I'm Facebook friends with several people who work at Epic Aircraft, and one of those people just posted that they received their long-anticipated type certificate for the Epic E1000. Now, you may remember the Epic LT. That was a 6-seat pressurized turboprop, but it was a kit, and you had to build it yourself, though, of course, you could get builder assistance from the company. In 2013, Epic decided to switch from selling aircraft kits to selling fully assembled certificated aircraft. Now, that is a huge leap because it takes a lot more work to get a type certificate from the FAA for a fully assembled certificated aircraft. In 2014, Epic then stopped selling the kit version of their airplane so they could focus on their certificate version, which, of course, is called the E1000. Initially, they thought they could get the aircraft certified by 2015, but that date kept slipping year by year, and now 4 years later, they finally have the certificate that they need to start shipping aircraft. Now, here's some of the specs. The E1000 has a 6.5 psi pressurized cabin with an air stair door just ahead of the rear seats. It, of course, has retractable landing gear. It uses a Pratt & Whitney PT6-67A turboprop engine, which is rated at 1,825 shaft horsepower, but is derated to 1,200 horsepower. For avionics, it uses a 3-screen version of the Garmin G1000 NXI. It has a service ceiling of 34,000 feet and a max speed of 325 knots and a normal cruise speed of 265 knots. It carries 288 gallons of fuel, and fuel burn at flight level 340 is 40 to 60 gallons per hour. So I'd like to extend my congratulations to CEO Doug King and his team in Bend, Oregon for a job well done. By the way, Epic now owns the building that used to be owned by Columbia and was used to build the Columbia 350 and 400 aircraft. I was factory trained on the Columbia, so I have been in that building several times, and I look forward to getting back to Bend, Oregon again someday to visit what is now the Epic factory. And finally, our story about a most unusual marriage proposal, floating weightless in a plummeting plane. Now, this comes from the Washington Post, and it says, Molly and Greg's love is weightless. Well, at least their marriage proposal was. Last month, Molly Blunduft Indelicato asked Greg Lynch to marry her in a literally gravity-defying maneuver. Molly popped the question aboard a converted Boeing 727 while the plane was doing lazy parabolas in the sky, the couple floating like a pair of spacewalking astronauts. I started planning this 2 years ago, said Molly, 29, a freelance health science and environmental journalist known among her friends for her organizational skills. Quote, the actual morning of the proposal, I thought we were going to get breakfast with a friend who was in town, said Greg, who's a software engineer. The Dulles Airport Marriott struck Greg as an odd choice for breakfast, but whatever. We show up, and I look around, Greg said. He's not here yet, so I said, maybe we should get a table. Molly said, there's no breakfast. We're here for the zero-gravity flight. So, a weightless flight from Zero G, a company headquartered in Northern Virginia. That alone would have made anyone's day, but Greg didn't know about the little box Molly had taken through TSA security and kept in her pocket of her blue flight suit. It was an elaborate web of deception, Greg said with a laugh. After a light breakfast of plain food, there's a reason these aircraft are called vomit comets, and some instruction, Molly, Greg, and the other Zero-G customers boarded the 727. The plane took off, and the pilot steered it in gentle undulations that approximated the gravity on Mars and the Moon. Then it was time for the main event, the weightlessness of space. The actual proposal was a little trickier than I thought it was going to be, Molly said. They tell you before you get on the flight not to try to swim. That's a normal reaction. And it's what Molly tried to do when she realized she was floating away from Greg just as she was preparing to pop the question. You see me in the video frantically trying to swim back in Greg's direction, she said. Figuring it was now or never, Molly pulled out the box, took aim, and threw it at her sweetheart. Greg dove for it and caught it. When he opened the box, out floated a ring inlaid with fossilized dinosaur bone, said Molly. He manages to grab the ring, and I popped the question, Greg, will you marry me? Greg's answer, absolutely yes. There followed a dozen more parabolas with Greg and Molly floating, flipping, and doing handstands, curling into balls, and being tossed around the cabin. The Fairfax couple haven't set a date yet for their nuptials. Hopefully the wedding will be as exciting as the proposal, Molly said. It sounds like they have no plans of ever hitting the ground. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then we'll get to our main topic, interviews at Garmin about the Autoland system. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's get to some updates. Last week I spent 2 days at Garmin's headquarters in Olathe, Kansas, which is just southwest of Kansas City, Missouri. They'd invited me to be out there when they announced their Autoland system, which we'll talk more about later in the show. I also met with a number of people in different departments, and I'll bring you some of those interviews in future episodes. While I was at Garmin, I held a listener meetup for our podcast listeners in a Starbucks near the Garmin headquarters. Of course, it was cold and it was snowing when we met, and some of the people who said they would be there didn't make it. But hey, my thanks to the two hardy souls who did show up. This was the smallest meetup we've had, but the benefit was it really allowed me to get into much more in-depth conversations with the people, more so than I was able to do at the larger meetups that we've had in the past. So one of the people who attended was Jaden Gerritsen. About a year and a half ago, Jaden contacted me asking for suggestions prior to his starting an internship at Garmin. And I read his email here to you and gave some of my suggestions for how to make the best of his internship. And, well, apparently the internship went well because he graduated a year later in May with a degree in aerospace engineering from Kansas University. And then he started working with Garmin this past June full-time. Now, specifically, he's working on some of the non-TSO'd products, such as the G3X displays. And he told me a really funny story. This was great. Our meetup was on a Wednesday, which was the day that Garmin announced Autoland. They had announced to members of the press what they were going to be releasing the night before, but we all had an embargo time, which was 6 a.m., which meant we couldn't release anything about Autoland until 6 a.m. Central Time. So I stayed up until about 3 a.m. producing episode 127 and then woke up at 6 a.m. to upload the podcast so that you could hear about Autoland first here on Aviation News Talk. Well, Jaden got up on Wednesday morning while he was shaving at around 6:30 a.m. He was listening to episode 127 and he became alarmed and he was thinking, oh my gosh, someone leaked the information about Autoland to Max, because relatively few Garmin employees actually knew that it was going to be announced on that day. He said he quickly went on Google to see if anyone else had released the news about Autoland, and he was relieved to find out that I wasn't the only one talking about it. So, funny story from a bright young man who I think will go very far in this industry. I also talked with Bill Watson, who listens to the show. Bill spent many years working for Motorola in Illinois, but he got caught in a layoff and decided to move to Kansas to join Garmin about 5 years ago. He's a system test engineer on the G5000 program, supporting the Cessna Sovereign and Latitude. Those are very high-end business jets. Essentially, he does testing of the system as new software features are being rolled out to make sure that when the developers added new features, they didn't accidentally break any other parts of the software. And by the way, this is just one of the biggest challenges in software development. No matter what company you're in, anytime you make a change to the software, there's a possibility that you'll break something that used to work perfectly fine in the software. So pretty challenging job, and it was great to meet Bill. So I had great fun during my 2 days visiting Garmin. Afterwards, I flew via Delta up to Duluth, Minnesota, where I met with a number of people. One of the first things I did was get a tour of the factory from Gary Black. Now, Gary has worked for Cirrus for 22 years in a variety of roles, including as a test pilot, later as a regional sales director, and now as a business development manager. And it's been more than a dozen years since I last toured the factory, so it was great fun to see some of the changes there. One of the changes, of course, is that they're now building the Vision Jet side by side with the SR20s and the SR22s. We started in Gary's office where he had a couple of samples of parts, and he let me hold them because he said that people are not allowed to touch parts on the assembly line in the factory. Now, first he gave me a very lightweight rib from the wing of an SR22. It was made of carbon fiber, and man, it was phenomenally strong. You could probably use that thing as a hammer. He also gave me a section of the fuselage that was essentially a foam core sandwich. It had 2 layers of carbon fiber, and between the layers was a thick layer of foam. Well, not that thick. It was probably less than 1/4 of an inch. Now, this piece was also incredibly strong, and Gary explained that the foam was used in sections of the fuselage where more curvature was needed, and that the foam essentially gave the material, the carbon fiber material, more flexibility to be bent into the shape required. Now, the SR20 and SR22 have a monocoque fuselage, and to visualize that, imagine you took the fuselage and you sawed it into 2 pieces by running it through a sawmill, starting at the engine compartment and running all the way back to the tail. You would then essentially be left with a left half and a right half to the airplane. And that's how the shells of the airplane arrive from the Cirrus parts factory, which is in North Dakota. Gary showed me how there's about a 1-inch overlap of material along the top and the bottom of these half shells. And they essentially glue these 2 half shells together and then heat them in an oven for a couple of hours to fuse them together. There are at least 3 times in the build process, maybe more, I think I lost count, where the airplane is heated in an oven. And they have a rather clever way of doing this. You can imagine the oven as being a very large room where the sides, and these are metal sides, can be raised so that workers can freely walk into this room, this oven, from any direction. They assemble various parts of the plane inside the large room, and then when they're ready to heat the airplane, the sides of the oven drop down to form the room around the airplane, and that room becomes the oven. And after a couple of hours, at a couple of 100 degrees, they open the sides of the room again, and the airplanes are moved on to their next build station. By the way, in one of the ovens, I think I recall that Gary said they could have 1 Vision Jet and 2 SR20s or SR22s together in that oven at the same time. So that should give you an idea the size of this oven. I also saw the carbon fiber pressure vessel, which forms the cabin of the SF-50 Vision Jet, which can hold up to 7 people. Gary asked me to guess how much it weighed. I guessed 80 pounds, and he told me it actually weighed just 40 pounds. So Cirrus has some remarkable technology in their factory, and it was fascinating to walk around and see every step in the build process of these aircraft. So that was a really fun trip to Cirrus. Now, earlier this week, once I got back home, I had a really fun flight with a client who bought a used SR20 last year and then asked me to teach him to fly in it. He passed his private in the plane a few months ago and now wanted to do a mountain checkout. So we flew up to the Mammoth Yosemite Airport in Mammoth Lakes, California, and he chose that one because he thought it would be the most challenging destination, and I think he's right. Often I do mountain checkouts to the Lake Tahoe area, and you can travel to those airports at lower altitudes, slightly lower, and the terrain is not quite as daunting as it is there at Mammoth Lakes. Now, the elevation of the airport is 7,134 feet, which makes it the highest airport I've flown into in all of California. The highest airport I've flown into is in Leadville, Colorado, which is at an elevation of just under 10,000 feet. And the area at Mammoth Mountain is best known for the ski area, and that has an elevation of 11,053 feet, which makes it the highest ski resort in California. We flew right next to the ski area, and you could see that they have been making snow on some of the slopes, and I just read the ski resort will open this coming weekend. We'll have to talk more in detail on a future episode about mountain flying, but I did want to mention that it was just a perfect day for the trip. We had canceled this planned trip a couple times before because of winds and later because of smoke from forest fires. We flew up there at 11,500 feet along Victor 230, and at that altitude, the winds were only 15 knots. And I generally avoid flying in the mountains when the winds are above 25 knots, as you're going to get more turbulence and updrafts and downdrafts, and that just makes it more challenging. Now, anytime I'm going to be on a long trip or in the mountains, I always carry my pulse oximeter with me. It's small enough to fit in my headset case, so I actually have it with me all the time. And this was the first time that I went to use it, and it didn't work. I opened it up, and one of the two AAA batteries was leaking, and it put corrosion on the terminals, so I wasn't able to measure my oxygen levels on this trip, though I did succeed in cleaning the contacts with white vinegar when I got home to remove all the corrosion. I put new batteries in, and fortunately, it works once again. Now, when I fly at higher altitudes, I try to keep my oxygen levels well above 90%. But this plane didn't have built-in oxygen, and I'm guessing my oxygen levels were around 90% or probably slightly lower at that altitude. Fortunately, we only needed to be up at 11,500 for maybe half an hour, and I didn't really notice that I felt any different. Though from past experience, I can tell you if I've been up at that level for more than an hour, I start to feel just a little sluggish. Well, we landed at the airport and we stopped inside the FBO, which is run by the city. They have a couple very friendly people that staff the desk there. They also have a small cafe, so if you want to stop in and get lunch, you can do that. There is a slope to the runway, and typically people land on runway 27, which is uphill, and then they turn around and depart on runway 9, which is downhill. The runway is 7,000 feet long, so even considering the density altitude, the runway is usually plenty long. All in all, it was a fun trip, and if you'd ever like some mountain flying instruction either to Mammoth or Lake Tahoe or anyone else, please contact me, and I'll be happy to take you flying in the mountains. Now, speaking of fun flying destinations, here's a recording from Jackson talking about one of his favorite destinations in Minnesota.
Hi, Max. Jackson in Minnesota. I have several fun flying destinations that I can mention, but I will stick with one that keeps me coming back for more, and that is Fagen Fighters World War II Museum in Granite Falls, Minnesota. The airport identifier is Kilo Golf Delta Bravo, and it's about 90 miles west of the Twin Cities, and therefore makes an excellent cross-country flight option for those in the Twin Cities. Fagen Fighters Museum is a privately run World War II museum with, as they'll tell you, every vehicle that's touching the ground is in working order. This includes one of 9 fully functioning P-38s left in the world, as well as a B-25, P-40, 2 P-51s, and a host of ground vehicles. There's also one of the only surviving examples of a Waco combat glider used in operations like D-Day and Operation Market Garden of the movie Bridge Too Far fame. If you happen to go there on a sunny day, it's pretty likely you'll be treated to a free air show from Don Fagen or his son Evan, as they frequently fly the airplanes in order to keep them running well. Nearby, the town of Granite Falls has an excellent restaurant called the Granite Grinder Cafe. Their sandwiches are delicious, and the airport has a really nice crew car to get pilots to the restaurant. There is also Prairie's Edge Hotel and Casino within about a mile for anyone that needs a place to stay overnight. For those interested, there is a website that you can preview the destination. It's FagenFightersWWIImuseum.org. Hopefully folks will find this to be an enjoyable destination.
Thanks very much, Jackson. And if you'd like to tell us about your favorite fun flying destination, go ahead and go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on listener questions at the top of the page, and go ahead and record up to 90 seconds about your favorite fun flying destination. Of course, you can also use that same connection to send us a listener question. Now, here's something I got as a Facebook message here just a few minutes ago. It comes from Michael Bork, and Michael is one of our relatively new Patreon supporters. He says, you probably get tons of such messages, but as a private pilot who started flying Wilgas, now that's, of course, the same airplane that the Draco is based on, who started flying Wilgas in Poland at an early age of 12 years old. He says he's now 41 years old and a U.S. citizen. I must say it's mind-blowing that I can sit here and just send you a message. Well, Michael, this will probably blow your mind when you hear this coming out of a podcast. Please keep the podcast going. You're not only an inspiration to many up-and-coming pilots, but also a wealth of quality and at times life-saving knowledge. And he continues on to tell a little bit about what he's doing. He chose not to do an airline career, but he's working as a robotics engineer. But he likes hearing about other kinds of aviation besides airlines, which is why he keeps listening to the podcast and supporting it. So, Michael, thanks so much for your note and for your kind words. And, I have noticed that over the last couple of years when I've been doing this podcast, much of the engagement that I get from listeners like Michael are people who support us on Patreon. So if you'd like to become part of this highly engaged group of people who interact with me and help support the show, go ahead and sign up to send us a few bucks a month. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can read on that website about all the different support levels that you can choose. And here's why it's important that you join, because every month, gosh, we lose a few supporters. Either their credit cards are no longer valid or they decide to drop out for whatever reason. And so we constantly need new supporters. We've got 270 Patreon supporters right now. I'd love to get to 300 sometime in the next couple of months. So if you find value in the show, please help us out. Here are some of our newest supporters. Jimmy Reeks is back with us. So Jimmy, welcome back. Cliff Farah, I think I pronounced that wrong, but thanks so much for joining us, Cliff. Cynthia Armentrout, Dan Friedman, George Wright, and Alan Markham edited his pledge up to $5 a month. Now, Alan's very clever. He realizes that anytime you increase your pledge, I'll read your name again. And Derek Thomas is back with us again as well. Or you can donate to us via PayPal if you'd like to do that. And you can do either a one-time donation or a monthly donation through PayPal. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And our thanks to Gregory Holbrook. He switched from Patreon to PayPal because he knows that we get a slightly higher percentage from the company when you do that. Also, Tom Turner at Master Flight Training. Now, we had Tom on the show here 2 years ago when he was talking about bonanzas. He's the executive director of the American Bonanza Society. So thank you very much, Tom. And we also have new one-time donations from Steve Porot and from Michael Fraley. And on every new show, I mention all the folks who donate more than $50 a month. And these include Brian Deere, who donates $200 a month. He lives in Northern California and recently acquired a Turbo 206. Tyson Weiss, co-founder of ForeFlight, who donates $100 a month. And here are our mega supporters who donate $50 a month or more. Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Tim Delaney, here in Northern California, flies an SR20. Stephen Elop, who flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation M2 and recently named CEO of API Jet. Larry Noe from New York, who bought a Cirrus SR20 in the past year. Mike Williams, he's the president of Keomac and TCB Composites, which make composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft, and he flies a 172. Seth Lake, he's a new DPE who gives check rides and specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his beach travel area. You can find him at vsl.aero, that's his website. And Rick Miller. Rick instructs in the Cincinnati area out of the Lunken Flight Training Center, as well as to private individuals. And he says he'd love to teach full-time, but he still has that day job for a few more years. So thanks to you and to all of our Patreon supporters who have joined us in the last few weeks. And coming up next, all of the details with our interviews on Autoland, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now here's our interview on Autoland. This was recorded in a conference room with several different people, including Phil Straub, the Executive Vice President for all of aviation at Garmin, Carl Wolf, he's Vice President of Aviation Sales and Marketing, but the person you're going to hear from most is Bailey Scheel. We're going to start out with her. She's the Senior Aviation Programs Engineer Manager for Autoland. Let's just talk about Autoland in general from kind of a top view. How long ago did Garmin start working on Autoland, and what was the general concept of how that was going to be used by pilots?
We started working on Autoland. Well, we have software actually dating back from 2011, I think. We started flying in 2014 and finally had OEMs get involved in 2017, 2018 timeframe. So it's been a long time coming. It's been something we've worked on quite a bit. And there have been quite a few building blocks that we've needed to ensure we have ready and in really good state before we can really bring it to the market. Our original idea was to help with situations where, there aren't always good outcomes, things where pilots maybe aren't 100% for that day for whatever reason, or they are fully incapacitated, and trying to find a way to get those situations to have a really safe outcome for those passengers and even the pilot, making sure that that person gets home safely that night.
When I first heard about Autoland, I thought about kind of the navigational kinds of things, but you've also gone much further than that in terms of communications. Tell me about how the system notifies people over the radio about what's going on at that point.
Yeah, so it was really important to make sure everyone in the airspace knows what's happening, since that airplane is now operating autonomously. We do communicate on 121.5 and for the emergency frequency. We also communicate to approach center tower, whoever makes sense for where the airplane is at that time. So we have automatic broadcasts of the airplane's in number, where they are, where they're going, what's the situation, and declaring that there is a possible pilot incapacitation. Additionally, we do have the transponder squawk 7700, so the emergency frequency. So as many ways as we can figure out how to declare an emergency, we're doing so.
And what I've read, the system does avoid things like terrain and somehow navigates around weather. Tell me about the weather part. The terrain part, I get that's probably a simpler problem. How do you circumvent weather?
The weather part, we use our data link weather using, the GDL69 SXM, using Cirrus weather. We also use Iridium weather, every source of data link weather that we can use, including even ACARS. We can use that and kind of compile it into one layered amount of weather. I kind of talk about it like it's the transparencies for overhead projectors. You just put them all in one pile and see them all at once. So we use all of that together in one big compiled list of weather and avoid all of it. We try to do what we can with the weather to avoid it. If we're completely surrounded by it, we're going to relax our tolerances so we can get through. So you can always route, even if there's, rain or something that maybe you'd prefer not to go through, but you might need to in that situation.
So let me jump in here for just a moment. As long as we're talking about weather, I did have some follow-up questions that came in from listeners. One of them asked, does it observe published minimums or will it land in 0-0 visibility? And Garmin got back to me and said that Autoland doesn't explicitly care about weather minimums, but does account for weather and winds at the destination. And they say that they do take into account visibility as part of their overall weather rating merit. So it sounds to me like they have a bit of a scoring system and visibility figures in there, but it could theoretically land in 0-0. The same listener also asked about, what about picking up ice? Can it turn on anti-ice? And the Garmin responded, the system can turn on de-icing systems if it's configured that way by the OEM, by the company that manufactures the aircraft. And a listener asked me about traffic. What if there's an airplane between you and the airport? Are you avoiding that, or are you counting on them to get out of your way?
We count on them to get out of the way. Since it's an emergency situation, we're declaring an emergency, we have priority. We need to get that airplane on the ground as soon as possible.
And I think everybody's imagination has run wild as soon as they've heard about Autoland. Obviously, people would like to maybe have it routinely land the airplane for them. So right now, this really seems like it's just for emergencies. Are there situations where they're non-emergency where you might use this, or where there might be some future capability?
For today, it's an emergency-only feature. If there's a situation where the pilot, is in question whether or not he thinks it's a true emergency, I'd say as a pilot myself, I'd use it. If I have that tool available and there's a risk that I might not have a safe outcome, I'd use the system to make sure that I get my passengers and airplane, down safely. I'll probably have to talk to the FAA or EASA, whoever it is, and explain why I made that decision, and they might not agree with me. But at the end of the day, I'm home safely with my family, and that's what's important. As far as future technologies, I imagine there's a world in which, this might be used more regularly. Just speaking on behalf of the technology, it's an interesting technology, but as a pilot, I want to help get tools in pilots' hands to ensure that they have a safe outcome. I don't necessarily want to replace the pilot because they're there to fly the airplane and we're there to support them. I'm
sure that pilots being pilots, they'll want to test the system to demonstrate it and make sure it works okay. Is there a way for them to do that without suddenly broadcasting on the emergency frequency?
No, we've done quite a few videos in hopes that will help satisfy the pilots so that they can watch the videos and understand what the system's doing at any given point. But if they hit the button, if they activate it in any way, it's going to declare an emergency.
But the good news is if they hit the button, they could always hit the button again and stop the process.
Right. If you hit the Autoland activation button, there's two different buttons. Activation button's one, the AP disconnect, or the autopilot button. That's how you disconnect. So yes, you can always disconnect it no matter what.
What if we happen to be headed toward a runway that just happens to be NOTAM closed? Any way for the system to know that?
At this point, no. We're working on trying to find better ways to understand NOTAMs, but NOTAMs are in such an odd nomenclature. Even as a pilot, I have a hard time understanding what they're saying sometimes. I'm like, I think that means emergency. I don't know. I'll figure it out. Sometimes you just have to call the people and ask what they're trying to say in that NOTAM. So if we can find a way to standardize those, I'd love to incorporate it into the system.
Certainly, the airlines these days are doing things that are close to Autoland, Cat 3C approaches, and airliners, 777s that can couple to an ILS and land with RVRs as low as 300 feet. A lot of people are going to think that, oh gosh, maybe I can use this for Cat 3 landings. What would you tell them?
So Cat 3 landings are very different from Autoland. Cat 3, there's only, 200 approaches available, whereas Autoland, we've had to be more generally available. We have thousands. We have tens of thousands around the world that we can use. So I think it's limiting of our system to compare it to a Cat 3 system. We have to route around weather. We have to do a lot of things that the pilot would do in a Cat 3 system. I can see where it's similar because, it does help with the landing part, but with the Garmin Autoland, it's so much more than the landing. It's the routing. It's picking a runway. It's doing all of these different things to make sure that pilot and that airplane get home safely.
An airline pilot pointed out to me recently that there's all kind of pre-flight requirements required for Cat 3 landings and airliners type auto landing. Any type of pre-flight that one does for Autoland to make sure that everything's going to be ready when you push the button?
The Autoland system uses the same pre-flight AFCS checks of the system. So the system does a self-inquiry. It'll do it all itself, and it'll tell you if there's an issue. Since Autoland isn't a required system, if something was to happen with that system, you can still use your autopilot. It'll still work normally. Everything normally will work. You'll just have a notice to get it into maintenance to find out what happened with the Autoland system.
And I'm just going to jump in to explain. Bailey mentioned AFCS. That's the Automatic Flight Control System, which includes the flight director and the autopilot system. I then asked the group, what was the most challenging aspect of developing Autoland? And you're going to hear first from Carl Wolf, then from Bailey Scheel, and finally from Phil Straub.
I'm not sure it's the most tricky, but one thing that's fascinating to me is when you think about the three pillars of aviation, right? Aviate, navigate, communicate. The Aviate is all about the autopilot, auto throttle. There are elements of the autopilot system, ESP, and things that all take effect. And we've done hundreds and thousands and bazillions of approaches, right, down to 200 feet. But this is all about going the rest of the way from 200 to the ground. So I don't know that was the most challenging part, but it was certainly where we spent a lot of time. Yeah. I think going from 2,000, slowing the airplane down, coming over the fence, and flaring. And then, staying as close to center line as possible, crabbing, you crab into the wind, high rudder, and then you relieve that and touch down. So I've got to believe, I'm not on the engineering side, but I've got to believe that was one of the more challenging aspects of the whole thing. And maybe even choosing the right airport, although, Eric goes through it like it was nothing, but I got to believe there was a lot of work there as well. So.
That's a good point. Yeah. The technical team would definitely say that the 200 feet and down is the most challenging part, just like pilots. That's the part that you really have to be on your game, focused, take a deep breath to calm yourself before you have the big event of landing. And it's the same for these airplanes, that when we're doing that development, we need to really think through what we're testing and why we're testing it, and making sure that we've covered all of our bases with various weather conditions. I think my favorite thing with this is just watching how many places we've tested it and seeing all that flight data. We've tested it upsloping runways, downsloping runways, high altitude, around here in Kansas, tailwinds, headwinds, ice, snow, slush, wet, dry, super awesome crosswinds. We actually might have demonstrated above the M600's limit for crosswinds because it was Kansas and it's windy. So just all of that testing to make sure we're really thinking through what we're seeing makes sense for end use.
I think about add to that. What Bailey just said is the real answer, I think, to what was the most difficult part. It was working consistently through all the corner cases, because runways aren't flat. The wind isn't always still. The runway's not always dry. So all of these things come together, and you have to test all these different points that you do it consistently, because we want a safe outcome. So that was the hard part. Just doing it once on a nice sunny day isn't the hard part.
So I assume the first time somebody pushes the Autoland button for real, there's going to be a lot of data collected, and folks will be looking a lot at that event.
For sure. We're definitely going to keep an eye on how this is used in the field and take that data and try to even improve the product from there. And also just look forward to seeing that the system was used successfully. I know personally, it's been very strange to work on a project that I hope never gets used, because that means that someone's had a bad day. But at the same time, like, I have family that are all pilots and they've had medical issues before in flight, and just thinking that this could have been there to help them it's really impactful.
And what were some of the steps that you took to develop Autoland?
So when we first started our development testing of Autoland, obviously the first day we weren't just going to go out and do a full touchdown, since that's maybe a little foolhardy. So we did a couple of different things. We started off on the ground doing centerline tracking and working on our steering algorithms. We worked on braking on the ground, but also up in the air, we created our own database we made a fake airport 5,000 feet in the air, and then practice approaches to it. And so we would flare and tune and make sure that we understood exactly how the airplane was going to perform up at that airport. And once we were confident of that, we then brought it down to the ground and combined everything into one full landing. And that was February 17th of 2016. So it's been a while that we've been working on this, and it's really exciting getting to see it out and available to talk about. I have so many people asking me fun questions today. It's been great.
So how long did it take from the time you started landing at mythical airports at 5,000 feet until an aircraft actually touched down on the ground?
We started our devel flight testing in 2014, so about 2 years on and off with various components. We had to test them with the routing algorithms and things first too, making sure we were turning smoothly and just, basic flight plan information before we even got to the landing dynamics.
I would imagine that last foot has got to be a little bit challenging coming down the runway. Are some of those landings perhaps slightly bumpy and not as good as a perfect landing? We've
had a couple of, I would say, firm landings early in development, but we've never had aircraft damage or anything from any of the landings. So I think that speaks to how well prepared we were and how well our pilots were thinking through the safety of just the landings themselves. And to date, we've done over 800. I think we're closer to 1,000 now of full auto landings.
And I was going to say, I've been on lots of firm landings and there was no auto land system involved. So. That's great. So that really says that this really is fairly, pretty darn good landing system.
Yeah. And there's a part of the engineering that goes into, deciding how firm to land, because we can end up in ground effect and, have a really nice greasy landing. But at the same time, that eats up runway. You want to get down and you want to touch down and, get through if there is water, get through any water and have a good firm contact with the ground. So we had to even think through that, like how firm is correct, how firm is the right amount to do this.
I think that's a very important point, because if you realize what's going on in the aircraft, you want to get the aircraft down as fast as you can, safely. So maybe it's a little bit firm, but stop as fast as you can, get the engine stopped and get the people out of the airplane. So I think that was our goal, as opposed to making it a perfectly smooth landing. But I think it works great.
Yeah, and I think as people think about auto landing, what they may not be considering is you don't have many other good options if the pilot has been incapacitated. And so if it's not an absolutely perfect 10 landing, that doesn't matter. But what you're saying is you're scoring lots of 9s, 10s, and so they are good landings.
That's right.
Correct. Yep.
And I'll jump here and say that most companies are reluctant to talk about future products, and so I didn't expect to hear much about where Autoland might go. But I did want to point out that it started with the Garmin G3000, which is kind of in the middle of Garmin's product line. Above that, they've got the G5000, which is for Part 25 aircraft. And below that, they've got the G1000, and of course, the aftermarket navigators, things like the GTN 650 and 750 navigators. Here's what Carl had to say about where they might go from here.
There is another aspect of that, though, that I think is interesting. Maybe Phil would be the best to talk about it. But we started in this mid-range of aircraft, right, for a couple reasons. First, we weren't sure. You could think about Part 25. My view of that early on was, it's a dual crew aircraft and probably not interested. I think it's interesting to know that there are some people interested in that for maybe the future, way down the road, 10, 15 years there. Maybe you're over water flights or international flights where they have to take a third crew member. Maybe they wouldn't have to with this system. Hard to say, but people are talking about that, and I think people are interested. The The other thing is, once we go to a smaller aircraft, let's say a single engine piston 4-place airplane, it lands slower, so maybe we wouldn't need the braking system. Maybe it could just roll to a stop. Might be one possibility. Maybe we don't need radar altimeter in it. It could be a little bumpy, a little slower. It'll find its way down to the runway. So there could be aspects of a lighter, smaller aircraft that we wouldn't need the systems necessarily that we've put in these two aircraft. So, or that I should say that the OEMs have put in those aircraft. So,
you raised kind of an interesting point. You've started in the middle, so not only could you be going lower, which is what I was thinking of, but also potentially higher in terms of even airliners that are doing ETOPS kinds of operation and might find something like this useful.
I would think so. Yeah, our hearts are set to go both directions, so we'll see where it takes us.
Well, I love that comment. Our hearts are set to go in both directions. We'll see where it takes us. I think Autoland has really captured the imagination of a lot of pilots. Clearly, Garmin looks at this as just the starting point. There's going to be a lot of exciting new things in the future coming along. Now, I had a number of follow-up questions, many of which were questions that came from you. And so I sent an email off to Garmin and I got these answers back. Many of the comments that I got from listeners initially were along the lines of, gosh, what happens if this shows up at JFK, or what happens if this system tries to land at Chicago O'Hare? So I ask, is Autoland programmed to avoid a busy Class B airport like Chicago O'Hare and choose a less busy reliever airport instead? And are there circumstances where Autoland might land at an airport at a large Class B airport? And I heard back that Autoland uses a discrete set of attributes to characterize each location. Class B anchor airports like O'Hare will cause the optimization algorithm to apply a penalty. Autoland will try to always choose the highest merit, most optimal destination first. If there are no other better choices, it will select a destination with the least weighted penalty. The weighting is OEM configurable, so yes, generally it will avoid Class B airports in favor of smaller airports while considering all of the other factors that go into the optimization scheme. And someone also asked about whether there is a minimum runway width when selecting an airport, and they say yes, minimum runway width is a factor. Now, I wanted to know, since this system will work with any GPS approach to an airport that has vertical guidance, was that only LNAV type approaches, or would it also work with LNAV plus V and LP plus V approaches, which have advisory vertical glide slopes? And they said, yes, GPS approaches with vertical guidance are used, and advisory guidance is perfectly fine. So that's great. That really means they have a huge number of instrument approaches that they can choose from. Here's another question. Is runway alignment done exclusively by GPS, or is there a camera involved? And the answer is no camera. It's done exclusively by GPS. And somebody asked about Aurora Flight Sciences. That's a company that was founded by a friend of mine, John Langford, who I've known since college days. They wrote, in July 2011, Aurora Flight Sciences demonstrated an Autoland capability in a DA-42 at Warrenton, Virginia. Is there any relationship between that body of work and Garmin's autonomy system? The answer is no. And another listener wrote in asking about system limitations for Autoland. Now, that's a very savvy question. Anybody who uses an autopilot should really get to know the limitations for that autopilot. And I wouldn't be surprised if most of them have about a dozen different items. I remember one that had 15 different limitations. But here's what Garmin says about the Autoland system limitations. Autoland is designed to be used in emergency situations only and should not be used in non-emergency situations where the pilot is fully capable of landing the aircraft. Autoland directs the aircraft to a suitable airport nearby for landing based upon a variety of conditions, including, but not limited to, weather, terrain, approach, runway, and aircraft suitability. The airport list for Autoland is comprised of any suitable airports within a 200 nautical mile radius, any airports the aircraft has passed since power on within 200 nautical miles, and the destination airport in the flight plan when Autoland is activated. For aircraft that are located in remote areas or over large bodies of water, Autoland may not be able to land the aircraft due to these limitations. Autoland may not function if the aircraft is experiencing mechanical issues or fuel exhaustion, or if the flight controls are not able to move freely. Autoland also requires the Garmin avionics and AFCS system to be operational for the feature to land the aircraft. So there you have it, Autoland from the people who make it at Garmin. Coming up next, we've got listener feedback and listener questions, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now here's a sample of some listener feedback that comes in every week. This comes from Cliff in Ohio via LinkedIn. He says, Max, I'm a few episodes of your podcast away from having listened to every one. That's amazing, Cliff. Good job. He says, I'll be starting a CFII side gig at Sporty's after a 15-year break for career and kids. And I can't tell you how helpful your podcast has been. Thank you. Patreon support is forthcoming. Well, and thank you for that, Cliff. And this is from Dusty in Montana. He says, Hi, Max. Just wanted to let you know that I'm a new private pilot. Your podcast on helping with check ride nervousness really helped me through it. Really enjoy going to work on Mondays, listening to the new podcast of the week. Keep up the great work. Well, thanks so much, Dusty. Thanks for listening. And here's an email from one of our Patreon supporters, Jonathan. He says, I enjoyed greatly listening to your latest podcast on Part 135 operations in the Meridian. Your show, as always, is both very entertaining and informative. Given your recent flight in the Meridian and your specialty of instrument instruction on the Garmin G1000, I thought you might find interesting my new YouTube channel called Life in the Fast Lane. In it, I document the use of my Piper Meridian while I tour the country with my band Eagle Mania, the world's greatest tribute to the Eagles. What makes this content unique is I include all aspects of flight planning and briefing in addition to the salient and interesting moments of flying while I use a GA aircraft for pursuits in which I have to be there on time. So far, there are 3 posted episodes, with a new one being posted every 2 weeks. I've cut 11 episodes so far, and so long as I'm flying to a show, no matter how challenging or easy the weather is, I'm going to generate an episode out of it. Obviously, there will be occasional times when flying is precluded by weather, and those moments are included as well. Like yours, I hope this content is both informative and entertaining. Thanks so much, Jonathan, and I will include a link to your Eagle Mania YouTube videos in the show notes. Now let's go to listener questions.
Max, Launchpad Marzari here from the Airplane Geeks podcast. Can you talk about what TFRs and other air restrictions have come up because of the forest fires? Specifically, has it changed the way your school has flying, and have you had to change any routes from any other personal flying you've had to do?
Thanks, Launchpad. Well, yes, TFRs pop up pretty quickly when we have fires, and I would say often within an hour or two of a fire, the TFR will appear. Good rule of thumb is if you're flying along and you see a fire, don't go flying over it. Now, if it's really tiny, yeah, you may want to go over it to see if there's any equipment on scene. And I report lots of fires. And typically I'll just see, hey, is there anybody on scene fighting the fire? No need to report it. If it's large, yeah, people already know about it. And so you want to stay away from it because CAL FIRE is going to have planes both fighting the fire and directing the operations over the fire. So typically they're going to have a twin turboprop, which is going to be thousands of feet above the fire, directing in the fire bombers, which are going to come in at much lower altitude. So you don't want to be anywhere near there, whether there is or is not a TFR. Now, we did have a TFR over the Kincaid fire here in Northern California. That was probably about 60 miles north of us. And so, no, that didn't affect any of our flights per se. However, and by the way, I should mention those TFRs probably go up typically around about 7,000 feet. However, it did affect us from a smoke standpoint. A lot of smoke was blown downwind from the fire, and even though we're 60 miles away, we had days where we had 3 and 4 mile visibility, and the air quality was poor. You just didn't want to be up there breathing that stuff. So I know I canceled flights on at least one day because of low visibility, canceled another flight up to Mammoth Mountain because we had some smoke in the air that day, and the winds were also a little bit high. And you can usually smell the smoke when you're up in it, and it's not nice. By the way, speaking of smells, I flew over Gilroy a couple of days ago with a relatively low-time pilot, and I said, hey, can you smell the garlic? And we were only 2,000 feet above the ground, and we could smell the garlic in the fields below of Gilroy, California, which is the garlic capital of the world. And here's a question from Brett in Northern California. He says, hi, Max. Thanks for such a great show. Love it as always. I've learned a ton from you and trust you will have a good answer to this nagging question. Well, I hope so. He says, I'm about to start my flight training, and I've noticed that some planes have a fuel selector switch that allows you to choose a fuel feed from the left tank, the right tank, or both. Through various means, I have learned that it's important to switch between tanks as you fly every so often to keep the plane balanced and to ensure that you don't run out of fuel in one tank. In fact, I think I recall that there have been accidents from pilots forgetting to do just that. Yes, there certainly have been. My question is, why wouldn't you just leave the selector switch on both? Wouldn't this make sure the tanks stay the most balanced as possible while ensuring you don't forget to switch tanks? Maybe this is common practice, but I haven't heard specific advice on why there is a left, right, and both, and why you'd want to use left and right when you can use both. Thanks in advance for the help, and thank you so much for all that you do to keep pilots informed and safe. Well, Brett, great question. The only aircraft with a both position on the fuel selector are high-wing aircraft such as Cessnas. Since the fuel tanks are above the engine, gravity pulls the fuel down to the engine. But in low-wing airplanes, a pump is needed to pump fuel up to the engine. And if there were a both position and one tank went dry, well, that pump would then be sucking air into the engine from that dry tank, which would not be good. Hence, there is not a both position in every low-wing aircraft that I have ever seen. And yes, in aircraft like the Cessnas that do have a both position for the fuel selector, pilots typically will leave it in the both position all the time when they're flying. However, sometimes the tanks will still drain unevenly. This might happen if you're flying a lot of turns in just one direction. It can also happen if the aircraft is not rigged properly and the rudder trim is not set correctly. Whether your airplane has a manual rudder trim or not, there's still a trim tab on the rudder, and that might not be bent in the correct position. In that case, when you're in level cruise flight, the slid skip indicator, which is the black ball in round gauge aircraft, won't be centered, meaning that you need to constantly hold some rudder pressure in level cruise flight, which is atypical. And if you didn't hold some rudder in an improperly rigged aircraft, the plane would be flying ever so slightly sideways through the air, which could cause one tank to drain more rapidly, even with the fuel selector in the both position. So in that situation, if a pilot noticed that his or her tanks were draining unevenly, they would switch to either the left or the right tank to help rebalance the fuel in the tanks. And it occurs to me that I rarely talk about pilotlearning.com. That's the website where I have several online courses. If you want to learn everything there is to know about the Garmin G1000, I've got a course for VFR flying, a course for IFR flying, and then a separate course which talks about learning to fly GPS and WAAS instrument flying approaches. So go ahead and check it out, pilotlearning.com. The course is varying price from $59 to $79, but there is a monthly membership fee that you can pay for just $29.95, and you can get access to all the courses, and you can sign up for as many months or as few months as you'd like. So check it all out at pilotlearning.com. And if you would, please take a moment to tell your friends about where they can find the Aviation News Talk podcast, because I'm sure there are lots of people out there that would like to learn some of the things that we're talking about. Now, if your friend doesn't know what a podcast is, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, because I'm sure they know what an app is. And we have a dedicated app for the Aviation News Talk podcast for both iOS and Android. Go out to either app store and then search for Aviation News Talk. And yeah, those apps are totally free. And don't forget to check out our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. We'd love to get just a few more Patreon supporters, get us up to 300. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.